Hi there everyone, this is week 3 of our class, Aesthetics and Theory of Communication. Things are moving along as they should, and you may notice that I'm a little behind schedule with the week 2 analysis grading. I've got through about half of those. I'm going to be working on the rest of those today, and tomorrow you'll have my feedback. By the weekend for sure. Had a few extra tasks that I had to work with this week, so it's put me a little bit behind in my grading, but I will get those to you very soon. Otherwise, things are on track. I do have the feedback to you on the week 3 exploration, and so that should help give you some input leading into the exploration for this week. While I'm still working on getting your feedback on the exploration for week 2, I can make some general comments on the use of color in the You Cannot Hide It ad from the Denver Ad Club. And so far, the ones that I have seen have been really pretty much on target. What we do have is, while there's a number, let me go back so you can see the entire image, there's a lot of color in this composition, and we could get down to the minute color details like the skin tones of the boy under the stairs and the colors of his clothing, but really all of them fit into 3 general color categories or color blocks. We have the green that is mostly along the left-hand side above the stairs. We have the warm orange that is really representing the light coming from this light bulb, as well as light coming from an unseen doorway that we can assume is at the top of the stairs. We know that because we see the shape of the door in the light that's being cast into the space. And then there's the blue that's beneath the stairs, and this really represents the shadows. And so these are our major colors. A few things to look at. While there are, well, this is, I kind of grouped this into general color categories. Remember that colors come in various values. So there's tints and there's shades of each of these colors. So you do have tints of orange, which would be the very light color. It's sometimes I've seen this described as yellow, and could be in the yellow-orange range. There's differing lightnesses and darknesses of green and also of blue. So we have the really deep midnight blue in the stairs. This is a little bit lighter where there's some light shining onto it. And then down here around the boy, we have the very pale blue, kind of a teal, and even in his clothing there's dark blue of his jacket. His jeans are a little bit lighter but still a darker shade, and in the inside of the hoodie and so forth. So so you see this is actually the colors sampled from the ad itself. Occasionally I see the orange up here described as brown, and the thing about brown is that on the color wheel it's not a distinct color hue. Brown is typically one of several things. It could be a dark shade of yellow, a dark shade of orange, or a dark shade of red, or some of the color hues in between those, the intermediaries, like yellow-orange or orange-red, and so forth. So if you look at what the darker shades of orange or yellow look like, they are what we would call brown. So as far as the color wheel and formal color theory, we would have an arrangement somewhat along this line. I might nudge this arrow a little more towards the yellow to be a little more accurate. So from what we know of the standard color schemes, this would probably fit the split complementary model. And just to explain why this wouldn't fit some of the other possibilities, in a standard complementary pair, it's 2 colors. So you would maybe just have the blue and orange without the green, but throwing that green in there gives it a little more color richness and So it's that third color hue, and that puts it more into a split complementary arrangement. Um, you can see that if you look at the arrows I have drawn on here, and this was done very quickly, it's probably not precise, but what this shows is it's not an exact thing. Like if you look at the textbook models of split complementary, these would be exactly the same distance apart, and this would be exactly directly across. There's a little bit of flexibility in there. Um, the only thing you want to watch for is that if these colors get too far apart, then you're moving more towards a triadic color area. But since the blue and the green are really closely related on the color wheel, it's more split complementary. So what this really allows is for these colors to interact really strongly, because you know that complementary colors are high contrasting. So what we have is the shadows, which are in blue, are really enhanced by the presence of that orange, because the warm color tends to pop forward towards the viewer. We saw that with the Iron Man poster from last week, and some of the other ad designs and poster designs. And the opposite of that, cool colors tend to recede away from us. This is just sort of a visual effect that they have. So what that allows is for this hiding space to feel a little more claustrophobic, perhaps, or isolated. It drives it back more into the background. The green is sort of an intermediary. I think at least one of you described it as sort of a transition from the orange to the blue, and of course blue and orange or blue and yellow would make a, if mixed, would make a green, so it does allow that transition. And a few of you pointed out the connection with the exit sign as sort of this is a symbolic meaning, that this is the way out is towards the pursuer instead of trying to hide. So we could interpret it that way if we want. And if we're talking about interpreting any kind of symbolism, we could think about the purpose of the ad as being this message that they'll find your ideas and they'll make them famous. So them coming to look for your ideas is actually a good thing, but the boy is hiding, not realizing that they are shedding light or shining a light upon his creative ideas. But that really is getting into some speculation. We can't really know for sure that that was what the designers had in mind. Could be. From a color psychology standpoint, cool colors tend to be create a more of a depressed mood or a low key mood, and so the blue being associated with the boy who looks very fearful in his face, but is also very hunched and tense in his body language, that connects really well. If you think back from last week's presentation, there's that movie poster with Jason Bateman, and he's struggling with the children, and his background is blue, where Ryan Reynolds is with the young ladies, and his background is orange, and he has much more upbeat expression. So that idea is represented here as well, with the blues connecting with the more low down depressed emotions. The orange is more active, and while there's not any specific expressions that we can interpret, it could be seen as sort of the light is invading the space, and so is this person who's about to come into the space. So there is that as well. This is the Adobe Color CC breakdown of the ad, and you can see this is much more precise than the little diagram I had created, but you can see this is almost a textbook split complementary scheme. I'm going to continue to get your feedback to you on those assignments. If you do have any questions, please do let me know if anything needs clarification. This last week of content, we're going to be looking at composition, and that is in the form layer of aesthetics. So this is how everything's put together. How are they arranged? How are all the pieces of this image and this design arranged so that they create a very specific experience for your viewers? Because as media creators, and this is a mantra that you can carry with you, is that nothing is left to chance. Everything that goes into any media creation is purposefully planned. We saw this in the presentation on color with the Breaking Bad infographic, where we saw how every color in every episode of that show is specifically picked. And the same thing goes for the composition of the shots. Think about filmography, how they control for the zoom, if you want a close-up or extreme close-up or a medium shot or a long distance shot of an image, and how they use perspective with lines leading into the distance and so on. So these apply there. Directors will plan these things. That's why we have storyboards. And so this is what we're looking at now. It really influences how your audience experiences the media you create. On the next few slides, I'm going to show a set of examples. And as you look at these, think about, take note of what catches your eye first, and look for what the designer purposefully calls attention to, and also note how they went about calling attention to that element. Like how is it emphasized over everything else in the image? Some of these will be pretty straightforward, and some may not. And the first example is probably familiar to you. Next. And the third. So in each of those instances, there was a clear focal point. And let me go back to each of these. With the Chipotle Scarecrow commercial, we saw the scene in which he finds the pepper. And it's that color contrast that is used to establish the dominant element. And that's what this is. This pepper is the dominant element because of its strong contrast with the green environment that it's in. Everything around it is green, and that's its complementary colors. So it's going to have extremely high contrast, and that makes it stand out. That's one of the main techniques for establishing dominance, is to make something different, usually in color, sometimes in value, so lighter and darker, sometimes texture, but especially color is effective for making something stand out and really grab attention. In this case, you probably noticed the floating form of this man above the pool. He doesn't have a very strong color contrast. It's a little bit of value contrast with the shadows in the background and the windows, but what really works in this case is the lines that direct our attention in a specific direction. The red logo down here is certainly an attention grabber, but it really comes secondary to this focal point right at the center. This is called framing, where you have these squares that can recede in size, and also leading lines, which I'll get to later. And in this case, there's value contrast, so the girl is being seen through this opening, this gap in the person's teeth, missing tooth there. So everything around her is brighter, and so that's a value contrast, and it immediately calls attention to that spot. It's also a break in the patterns. We have these teeth that create a repeated pattern, and then suddenly there's one gone, and that is something that we are instinctively wired to notice, is when there's a difference in a pattern. So that's another technique. Those are some examples of establishing dominance in a composition. And composition is all about guiding your viewer's experience, which I've stated a few times already. I used to have this worded as manipulating your viewer's experience, but manipulating is a very negative word, but it's not inaccurate. You are very much manipulating the viewer's perception so that they receive your media in the way that you want. And you're trying to deliver a very specific message, and so you compose it in such a way that that message is clearly expressed. One of the first principles in composition is dominance. It creates the focal point, and that is created through contrast. And I've said that already, but just to reiterate, it's created through contrast. We saw color contrast, we saw some value contrast, we saw contrast in a broken pattern, also isolating something. So using white space. So if you have an object that is framed within a large open area, it tends to stand out. And we'll see an example of that as well. So looking at this image, you probably first notice the coffee mug, because it is orange against the blue background, and that is, what is that? Complementary color pair. So it's going to stand out very strongly. There are other elements that are important, like the A Perfect Blend title, but there's very low color contrast with the background, and so it takes a back seat to the orange cup. That might be what would be called subdominant. We saw this one last week as well. Another complementary color pair, orange and blue, makes that little action sequence stand out from the rest of the poster. And here we have both a color contrast and a pattern change, where the blue container stands out because it's different from the rest, both in terms of color. Those are low contrast, so they recede back lower on the visual hierarchy. So we would have this piece stand out as our dominant element. And this is an example of use of white space. You've got a very busy scene where it looks like there's some people cooking out. There's all these little pavilions or huts, and but none of this is really emphasized in any way. The duck is what really stands out because he's floating in this, apparently floating in midair, but if you look closer you see the ripples in the water. From there, you might then take notice of the pure water filter or Unilever water filter logo down here. And so the idea is that the water is so clean you can't even see it. It looks like it is open air. But through using this white space, they've really framed this duck's form and made it stand out as the dominant element. And I included this one to make a point, and that is, just because something is the main idea of your, or the subject of your design, doesn't mean it's automatically the dominant element. You have to purposely make it the dominant element through use of visual manipulation, through color, through size, through value, and so forth. In this case, this ad is for a car, but the car is certainly not the dominant element. It's tiny. You can almost miss it in the background. What would be the dominant element? Perhaps the green of the hills, the environment, and then from there you might notice the Hybrid Synergy Drive logo up here, and really the car becomes pretty much at the subordinate level as far as the visual hierarchy goes. So the idea is that this is very deliberate. If I'm going to make this duck my dominant element, then I've got to really make that duck the dominant element by taking steps to ensure that it's noticed. Same thing here. These are done very deliberately. So just because it's the idea of the ad doesn't mean it's automatically going to catch the viewer's eye. You have to make it that way. And once you understand that some of these rules, you can create ads like this that kind of reverse the rule. So you're bending the rules like an expert because you understand how that works. There was, and I wish I had the ad, but from the exploration there was another one that was about domestic violence, and it had a quote saying, "Oh, I banged into a doorknob," and then there was this scene of a messy room, but only after you look through the scene do you notice the knob of the door has been replaced by a fist. So it's kind of a metaphor, but it's not called attention to. You have to explore that scene in order to figure that out. So it's not made the dominant element on purpose. And I've mentioned visual hierarchy several times already. Visual hierarchy is a prioritization. So you have your dominant element, the thing that's going to call the most attention to itself. But then you have the rest of the image, the rest of the scene, if it's a video. So, okay, so where do we go from here? This is the dominant element is our entry point, but you don't stop there. Then you want them to move on to the next most important thing, and then the next most important thing after that. And you use the same techniques to a greater or lesser extent for each one. So you want to use that that contrast to establish your dominant element, and then use either another form of contrast or some other technique to make your subdominant element stand out, but just slightly less than your dominant element. So it goes from that first item to the next item. The reading suggests at least 3 levels. It doesn't say you're limited to 3 levels, so you could have multiple subdominant elements that go in an order of priority. The term subordinate just really means everything else. So if you have a scene of a very messy room, all that clutter on the floor is going to be the subordinate element. It's there. It's you can see it. You might notice it, but it's not being called attention to. This is a pretty straightforward visual hierarchy. There's only 3 real focal points. First is this large musical instrument made out of a gun. Second is the Start Music Indoor tagline. And then third would be the identification, the logo, and the brand identification, International Street Musicians Day, and the date. So there is a very distinct hierarchy of priority. They're not always quite so cut and dry. Here we're revisiting this one again. This is a good example because there's different techniques used to prioritize the order of importance. The coffee mug is the immediate attention getter. But not only the coffee mug, but also the coffee mug with the, is that a treble clef? Definitely a clef, a musical clef. Why that's important, and this is really taken in together. You don't notice the mug without the smoke of the treble clef coming out, or the steam. And that's symbolic. That represents the 2 main ideas, coffee and music. And then once we have taken note of the coffee mug and start looking at the rest of the poster, our eye then goes to a perfect blend because it's large, and you can't bypass that coming down to the rest of the details. So then we see that, and that is the name of the business. I believe it's a cafe. Accidentally changed slides. And then where do we go next? Probably to this name, Katie Day and pianist, July 22nd. So that's the featured musician. And where does your eye jump from there? Most likely to the plaza logo over here. So then we have, so this is the order of importance. It's the symbol of the whole idea, the name of the place, the musician, and the location. And there's a lot of extra details, but those become really subordinate to everything else, to these major details. So once you get all this in, then you're allowed to get into the fine print. So you can see how that's very deliberately set up. Not necessarily by its arrangement, because you certainly would jump to the name first, but then you can bypass some of these smaller details because that bright white lettering is much more attention grabbing. And again, we've got the most colorful item in the image is this tractor. It's like a toy tractor made to the size of a real tractor. This represents how the child is seeing this tractor as a big toy. So this would be the dominant element, and probably the child, and then probably this logo with the tagline, "Children don't see the danger, keep them safe from harm." So it creates sort of a triangle of importance. This is something that I really want you to keep in mind, is that you're not limited to the photograph itself. If there's a logo or text added to an image, that counts. That's still part of the composition and still part of the visual hierarchy. So do not discount these parts that have been added to the image. Even this little URL over here in the corner is part of this composition. When the designer is putting this type of thing together, they will place this element, and you can see that white space around there. They will place these elements in a way that works with the composition. They will consider how it affects the balance and the visual hierarchy of the piece. And speaking of balance, balance is a visual effect that is established by the arrangement of the various pieces of an image or a scene in a movie or any kind of visual media. This is a very balanced, symmetrical composition. You can almost split this right down the center by the two halves of the page, and it's nearly a mirror image. They're not exactly a mirror image. This is at an angle. The two sticky notes are at a little bit different places, but everything is counterbalanced from one side to the other. This would be an asymmetrical balance. You have the tractor, which is really heavy in terms of visual weight, counterbalanced by a collection of objects over here. The child, the logo, even the car in the background. So it is asymmetrical because you don't have this kind of mirror imaging, but it's still balanced because the total, the sum of these elements over here balances the elements over on this side. The idea of balance also allows for the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is an idea that at least I first learned about through photography, but it is applied in other disciplines as well. It works in video, in film, and also in more traditional visual art, painting, graphic design, what have you. The rule of thirds is the suggestion that you place your main subject away from the center. And they suggest using these imaginary lines as guides to help you place that subject. So in this case, the seagull is offset from the center up to the upper right. And they suggest aligning your subject with these lines, either vertically or horizontally, whichever works best, In this case, the body of the bird is aligned with the horizontal, upper horizontal line. The legs, that forward leg follows the vertical line, and the kind of center of gravity is placed where those two intersect. And if you consider those intersections to be the ideal placement for your subjects. The rule of thirds is not always needed and should not always be used. It is used especially if you want to capture a sense of action. So this isn't a very action-packed image, but you see where the bird has come from. You see the trail of his footprints, and you know that he's walked to that point. That action has taken place. It gives us that history. You wouldn't see that if the bird was just centered as a portrait in the middle. You wouldn't get that sense of his context with the environment. This is another example. You see the placement is roughly about, of this little monster, is right about the intersection of the lower right intersection of the lines. Place his foot. And this is another one that shows the action. It shows the history. You see how this person has dug this trough through the pavement with their foot. And where's the foot placed? It's at that lower intersection, more or less. It doesn't have to be precise, just like I was talking about with the color arrangements. The rule of thirds doesn't have to be precisely aligned, but ideally you get it pretty close. And that's the focal point, is this foot. That's the product that's actually being focused upon. Also notice these lines. I'm going to get to leading lines in a moment, but this is kind of an early example of how that line pulls our attention, even this line, to this location. Here's a good illustration of the rule of thirds. Yeah, there we go. The golfer is right aligned with this vertical line. He's swinging the club in a way that it would have swung into this space that's allowed on the left side. And this really accommodates our natural sense of how things work. If he was aligned over here to the left, he would have been swinging into the side of the image. It would look like there's not enough space for that action to take place. Intuitively or rationally, we know that this is just an image and he's not really isolated in this box. But perceptually, that's how it comes across. So shifting his position over to the right allows room for that golf club to swing into. Also allows room for the slogan to appear there. But that is also a factor, is to consider how our natural perceptions are accommodated. Same thing if someone is looking into the distance in a particular direction. In this case, the police officer is taking a photo, actually, and since he's looking to the right, they've shifted him over to the left so that it gives this space for him to be looking into. And this one as well is arranged away from center, so this allows us to see the relationship of the child to the tractor. And let me know if you have any questions on that. The rule of thirds is an area where I see a lot of common misperceptions or misunderstandings, so make sure that you have a good idea of how that works. But the real idea is that it allows a sense of action, of drama. If there's a visual narrative that's taking place, then the rule of thirds can really be useful in conveying that. And now, as a last factor in composition, I want to talk about leading lines. Anywhere you are, there are lines everywhere you look. If you look around the room you're in, you'll see lines in the corners of the room, along the where the wall meets the ceiling, and wall meets the floor. There's lines on the table, in the curtains, along the street and sidewalk. And if you've ever taken an art class, you may remember perspective, and that is, perspective is how you show depth. Lines converge, they come together as they move into the distance. And because of our natural perceptions, we know that that represents something receding away into space. Well, sometimes if you plan your images well, you can take advantage of those lines, those naturally occurring lines, to direct the viewer's attention. We have a tendency to naturally follow lines with our eye. And in this case, this is a good example. There are tons of leading lines in this image. They appear in the edges of the walkway next to the reflecting pond. Those are literal lines. The edge of that sidewalk is a defined line. And notice they all point in the same direction. They all point into the background where they converge right at the door of the Taj Mahal. But not only are there those literal defined lines, there's also implied lines that are created by connecting the dots. There's an example, but I didn't mean to move to that slide yet. These stones in the walkway that aren't connected to each other, but because they are aligned, we perceive them as being a continuous line. That's that Gestalt principle that's from the readings. Same thing with the trees, the bushes. We connect those dots and create lines at the tops and the bottoms, and they recede in the same direction, and they take us to the front entrance of the Taj Mahal. That's a way of also reinforcing the focal point, reinforcing that dominant element, if we draw attention to it through leading lines. Just another example of how lines don't have to be physical lines, connected lines. They can be a series of objects arranged in a way that they create a line, because our brains, the way that we're wired to look for patterns and meaning, will connect the dots perceptually, and we'll see a line, just like we see here, with a line of the cutout holes in the fence, as well as the tips of the points in the fence, and it carries us along this curve. Notice that I do have the arrows pointing from left to right in this case. The movement doesn't have to be left to right. It could be right to left, but we're more likely to interpret it from left to right because we are English speakers. At least I think most everyone listening to this this archive will be a Western language speaker, which could be English or Spanish or any other Romance languages, like French. And we read from left to right when we read written words. So we are trained to perceive things from left to right, and that's why most often you'll see designs, visual designs, work in that way as well, just because that's our tendency. In other cultures where they read top to bottom, or right to left even, that will be adjusted to match their tendencies. Here we have some leading lines created by the rocks contours. It takes us to this focal point of the man and the rock that are wedged there between the two cliffs. And it makes this much more dominant than it would be otherwise. The title of the movie is larger than this object, either of these objects. Even the blurb up at the top is, through color contrast, has a little more dominance, but this is made much more prominent through these leading lines. And here, I'm glad I included this slide because I wasn't sure if I did, but there are lines in this composition as well. They're not as obvious, but the edge of this roof points in the direction of the child's eye, if you look where that would converge. and that's sometimes called an eye line or sight line. It's the same idea as a leading line. It carries us in that direction, either way. It just helps to create that extra little nudge, that direction where we're supposed to look. And there's another great example of that use of perspective and converging lines. Directs us right to the main subjects. And this was one from the exploration that I really liked because there's some more subtle leading lines. The truck is the focal point. That's the dominant element because it's lit. It's a lighter value than the surroundings, and so it stands out from the darker region. The moon has much more contrast, and so it really helps to call attention to that space. But then notice the lines created by the headlight, the light shining out from both headlights, then carries our attention over to the sheep. And this helps to tell this story, this visual narrative. A wolf in wolf's clothing, so it's kind of putting the truck in the position of the wolf in the story, and then establishes that by then showing us the sheep. That's sort of its prey. And here's this familiar image as well. We have the leading lines that direct us to this person at the focal point. And we have also some of those gestalt lines where the angles, the corners of the building create lines that direct our attention. And please let me know if you have any questions about any of the composition techniques I've described here. And look for these as they are applied in the You Cannot Hide It ad design, because many of these are applied, and so that'll give you a chance to really reverse engineer an example of these ideas at work. I'll look forward to seeing how those analysis activities shape up, and please get in touch if you have any concerns.